Welcome back to our lecture series, Paving the Path from Language to Literacy for Young Deaf Learners. We're going to pick up now with our final stage in our process, well on the way, the early school years.
The learning objectives that we're going to focus on in this last stage of development are to identify the developmental literacy milestones for children age 4 to 6.
We're going to further describe the relationship that needs to be made between language and text.
And to consider the impact that hearing loss has on this process.
You should be also able to, at the end of this lecture, talk about and describe what is meant by the alphabetic principle.
And further understand the importance and use of the term invented spelling, and particularly how it applies in the case of children with hearing loss.
So back to our graphic that we've been using to depict our path. We're at the last stop on this journey with early literacy learners and at the age range of 4 to 6.
And we decided to call this well on the way because you're not really there yet, as it were. I mean, you've got all of the foundational bits in place, but you're certainly still not a full-on reader and writer at this stage. You're really still only talking about children who are 6 years old. So what we're really talking here about is having now put everything in place so that from here on out, as the child really now is in first grade and moving forward, they have the foundational requisites so that they can at least be set up as well as we can have them prepared to learn to read and write and achieve those age-appropriate goals that we all hope for. What's important to remember as we think about this trajectory always is that this is fluid, and so that it's just an important It's an important thing to think about, that while it's fluid, we also, though, need to be mindful of when we're off the track. So as we're talking about milestones here, and you're thinking about the children that you teach, or if it's your own child, when you might be getting a niggling worry that, gosh, most kids between age 4 and 6 are doing these things, my child isn't there yet. These are the times when then you are a bit concerned and you need to maybe follow up and say, should further assessment be done? Should we be concerned because I don't see my child making these milestones or gains that we should be expecting to see so that my child is well on the way?
Some of the other things that are occurring at this stage is we're really starting to make those connections between language and text a lot more explicit. And particularly in the area of reading, we see a lot more of instruction, real direct and systematic instruction happening here. So if you're thinking about the child that's 5 to 6 years of age, probably beginning kindergarten, this is a time where formal reading instruction is starting to occur. So in our stages prior to that, those pre-reading stages, the pre-writing stages, we weren't really looking at instruction in the same way as we will be in this particular stage.
This is the stage, and it really is, in some sense, if you could put, neon signs flashing about a stage in this trajectory that's critical. I mean, they're all very important, but here is where you're really making that link between talk and text. So you've heard us speak about in previous presentations that notion that children have to understand that the language they use face-to-face, that spoken language that we've used the term that just falls out of your mouth, has something to do with the print on the page. By the time they're 4 or so, they have a sense that it does, but they don't know exactly how that works. So this challenge we set for them between the ages of 4 and 6 are figuring out exactly how it is that spoken language is captured in those chicken tracks on the page, and more specifically, how their spoken language is represented in the script.
It's a very critical stage in the development of reading and writing, and particularly this knowledge of the alphabet. And we're going to be talking about various skills that fall under that umbrella of alphabet knowledge and how it relates to both reading as well as writing.
And with respect to writing, we're going to look specifically at invented spelling as a way that gives you, well, I'd like to suggest probably the best insights of all as to whether a child has figured out how they can capture their talk in text.
So what are children doing at this phase? What are some of the developmental milestones that you should be looking for? Children at the age of 4 should be have mastered some of the book concepts, such as understanding a cover of a book, the title of the book, author, the pages of the book handling skills, kind of left to right orientation, sometimes referred to as concepts of print.
And they should also by this stage understand different purposes for reading. If you remember in a previous presentation, we talked about the importance of reading aloud from a wide range of genre, not just the fairy tales and the pattern books, but expository text and reading environmental print. So children by this stage should understand that you can read to find out things. You can read the words on the back of the Jello box, or jelly box, whatever they call it in Australia, to figure out how to make it. That you can read a sign on the wall and it tells you which way to go or what one is not supposed to do. This idea that reading carries meaning and is purposeful should be well established by this stage.
And in the previous stages, we've been talking a lot about language and how that seems to be the focus. And it's at this stage we start to take a shift and we become a little bit more print focused than we've been in the prior stages.
You will also see kids at this stage, just because they've had that much more exposure to print, because they're that much older, have now got a growing set of sight words they recognize. And that growing set of sight words becomes the springboard into reading.
They also can begin to decode some pretty simple words that have regular patterns that are phonetically regular, and they come to the learning to read process with some of that already under their belt, and then we take the next step where we're really systematically teaching them how to decode.
And maybe most importantly, or else very importantly during this stage, children develop alphabet knowledge. And what we want to be clear about here is we talked a lot before about recognition of letters and matching letters and notion of letter. This is this alphabet knowledge, this notion of how letters operate in terms of their relationship into making that connection between talk and text. And that's what we're going to explore quite a bit in the next few slides.
So we've already mentioned before that we're kind of fans of these umbrella terms. And so here's another one. Here's our umbrella again. This is, umbrella is labeled alphabet knowledge. And there's some sub-skills under this umbrella of alphabet knowledge, one of them being letter knowledge. And letter knowledge is really focused again on the print. And we've seen a strong focus on this in the prior stages, as Connie was just mentioning. At this stage, children should really be able to name most of the letters. Usually uppercase letters are easier than lowercase letters. We'll come back to that in a minute. But what they're able to do, and again, from all that exposure in their environment where we were previously telling them go find the A on the block or find it in this book, they're pretty accustomed to naming letters, finding them in their environment, and having had those experiences, most children at this age know their letters.
And interestingly, if you look at reading assessments for children around about this time period, one of the activities they're asked to do in an assessment is rapid letter naming, simply naming the letters quickly. So knowing the name of the letter is a really critical skill in terms of alphabet knowledge.
And what you just said, Connie, is a good point about that rapid naming of letters. If you remember when we were talking in our last lecture about rapid automatic naming, and that's an important skill, we were talking about naming things like colors or objects because children didn't know letter names at that point. And it's at this point when we start looking at their ability to rapidly name things, we can look to letters and to numbers because they now have that knowledge. The other skill underneath this alphabet knowledge umbrella is the alphabetic principle, and this is really key in reading an alphabetic language such as English. The alphabetic principle is the understanding of this systematic and explicit relationship between letters and sounds, and that's so important in terms of teaching children how to decode words when reading and encode words when spelling.
And the interesting thing about the alphabetic principle, it's that systematic relationship within a particular language. So the example we sometimes use and is if I could spell it for you in the air, it would be C-H-A-T. And if we were to pronounce that word in English, it would be
chat.
But if I told you we're now speaking French, it would be chat. I'm the one from Canada. So it either is cat or chat, because the sound symbol relationships that are systematic between sound and letter are different in French than they are in English. So the principle is the same, but what children have to uncover or unpack is the particular relationships that apply to the language that they are going to be reading.
So we're going to take now a couple of minutes and talk about the skills specifically, starting with letter knowledge. So letter knowledge, going back to what we've been talking about in the last couple of lectures related to language, is somewhat of a language-related ability. Children at this stage, they come to this age of 4 to 6, they know how to recite the alphabet, they know the song. Connie had mentioned earlier about how children sometimes LMNOP, they don't recognize that it's separate letters earlier in their developmental process, but at this stage they do. They understand that those are individual letters. So singing the alphabet is one thing that children do at this stage. They also are beginning to be able to name the letters and name the printed graphemes. So they know that that's an A and this is an M and that is a C. What is interesting about English is uppercase and lowercase letters have different configurations. In the English language, there's only 12 pairs of letters that share a similar visual configuration. And what I mean by that is, for example, those letters S, the capital letter S, or the uppercase letter S, and the lowercase letter S, they're very similar in their configuration. Whereas the capital letter or the uppercase letter A versus the lowercase letter A, they look distinctly different. So that in the end, children have lots of pairs to learn in terms of upper and lowercase letters. What we know from research is the uppercase letters are easier for children to learn. They're more distinct. And if you remember when we were looking at some of those writing samples of children earlier, lots of times they were written in uppercase letters. They're easier to make. They're easier for children physically to draw.
Exactly. If you remember the example of Max, now albeit he was having some troubles because he was only 3 making the letters, but the letters he was trying to make were the uppercase letter M and A and X. He was not going for the lowercase letters.
But what we know is that lowercase letters are really important because if you think about when you're reading and you're going to be doing beginning reading instruction, there's far more lowercase letters in words than there are uppercase letters. So some children need to be directly taught the lowercase letters in order to be ready for this next phase of development. Research shows us too that the greatest growth in children's ability to, in the area of letter knowledge, occurs around this stage between the ages of 4 and 5, which is handy because this is when we're getting ready to start instruction.
And again, this notion of touchstones or milestones, think about the deaf students and are they able to name letters? Can they do that? And if they can't, and if they aren't doing this by age 5 or so, then it's a bit worrying.
Letter naming it's an interesting connection between the two pieces of the under the umbrella that we were talking about. On the one hand, we had letter knowledge, and on the other hand, we had the alphabetic principle. So letter knowledge is just knowing the names of the letters. The alphabetic principle, again, is understanding that systematic relationship between the letters and the sounds. Letter naming is another skill that we often assess with young children. Can you name random upper and lowercase letters that are presented on a page? What's interesting is you can exploit that knowledge when you're making the transition to teaching children about the alphabetic principle because there's a phonetic component, a phonological component embedded in the names of letters. So for example, for most letters, the vowels aren't included, but if we think about continuous sounds, and a continuous sound is a sound that I can hold as long as I have breath. So for example, I can say, or...
I'm going to time
Yeah,
you.
go ahead. I can hold my breath a long time. We can say, we can say, we can hold those out for a long period of time. So continuous sounds, when we think about the letter name that's associated with them. So we'll take the sound, for example. The is produced by the letter M. When I say M, there's a sound at the end. The L sound is produced by the letter L. There's the sound. F. There's the sound. So you can exploit that with young children because most of them already know their letter names.
And interestingly, many kids, you don't have to explicitly teach that. They've been saying the letters, and if you say to them, listen to the word mummy, what letter do you think that maybe starts with? And if they know the letter M, they will make that connection. Not every kid, but many kids come to see that quite quickly because the letter names are there's such a great way to make that connection, whether anyone did it by design, that the letter name is that, it works very handily.
Stop sounds, on the other hand, these are sounds we need to say quickly. So an example would be the B sound or the D sound or the T sound. And we think about the letter names that produce those sounds. So B is produced by B-E. There's the sound at the beginning of the letter name, B-E. Or the D sound produced by the letter D-E, D. There's the sound. And then finally, the T sound is produced by the letter T, T-E. So again, if a child needs a little bit more direction, a little bit more pointing at that, it's within the letter name. The alphabetic principle. Again, this is that understanding of the systematic and predictable relationship between letters and sound. It's also known as phonics. That's what we typically call it. And when we're teaching phonics, research shows us that not all children, but many children need a very direct and systematic approach to learning these letter-sound relationships. And because this is really more directed towards instruction, we'll be picking this up a lot more in our next lecture where we talk about the practices, because this is something that we often directly teach as children are beginning formal reading instruction.
And one of the interesting things I think to point out here is sometimes we have a cart before horse situation, particularly with deaf kids. We see teachers working on trying to teach phonics and the alphabetic principle before the children have developed that phonological sensitivity and sense of sound that goes with the language. Those things we were talking about in our last lecture, they're kind of trying to do this before the child is ready.
And that's a really important point, Connie, because if you remember, we were talking about if you can do something through the air, like blending and segmenting, if you can blend the sounds to form the word man, or take the word man and break it into its parts, if you can do that through the air without print, it's going to be a lot easier than to apply that skill when you need to also focus on the letters and the sounds that they're making. So again, those are the precursor abilities to developing the alphabetic principle. We also just want to point out that letter naming and finger spelling are not the same things. We've had lots of discussions in our field about this. We've actually been in parts of research teams where we disagree about, we don't disagree, we're on the same page. We're on the same page, but others have said, oh, for example, here's an assessment of letter naming. Can we give this assessment to deaf children? Oh, sure, they can finger spell it. We'll say, no, that's not the same thing. So I know we use different manual alphabets, but I'll give the example of our printed letter M. This is our finger spelled M. So this actually represents the grapheme.
So more like this.
Yeah. There's nothing within this hand shape that gives us any information about M, that letter name, or the sound. There's nothing in that hand shape. Now, if I'm doing this hand shape along with saying M, using my voice, then there is that component there. But this alone, that's not letter naming. That's showing a grapheme, and that's a different skill. And so when you're assessing it or you're teaching it, you're going to need to find a different route if a child needs that. This goes back to when we were talking earlier about cued speech would be an avenue. You can be able to use cued speech for letter naming. Visual phonics, because we're talking at the sublexical level, you could use a system like Visual Phonics, that instructional tool, or cued articulation, which I know is probably more popular here. It's not supportive of some of the skills that we're talking about in developing the alphabetic principles. Finger spelling is a different skill. So once we've taught children the relationships between the letters and the sounds, and they've become developed some automaticity with recognizing letters and immediately being able to say the sounds, we can move into instruction in phonemic decoding. What we often find is young children, they know those letters, they know those sounds, they know how they connect, but they don't know what to do with them. So we need to teach them how to blend the sounds to form words. This relies on that ability that was acquired during the phonemic awareness instruction. So again, back to that idea, if you can do it through the air when we now have print, you'll be able to do it more readily. So at this stage, we're teaching the students how to connect each individual sound to its letter within a word. The words that we're working with young children are usually words with a consonant, vowel, consonant pattern. And words with that pattern often have a short vowel sound and differ only by one grapheme, or one letter or one sound. And so we need to teach children to look through the word, because just looking at the word as a whole is not going to they're not going to be able to differentiate it over time. This goes back to what we were talking about in our last lecture about the
lexical restructuring hypothesis.
The lexical restructuring hypothesis, where a lot of these words that children are dealing with at this phase only differ by one phoneme. So we need to teach them to look through blending words sound by sound to form them. So when we come back, we're going to talk about the development of phonemic decoding, and also related to both reading, decoding, as well as writing and coding.